All right. Good morning, teammates, and welcome to the TRANSCOM Show. I'm Major General Deb Kotulich, your Chief of Staff, and I'm thrilled to be here today. I want to thank all of you who've joined us here live in the C Auditorium and everyone out there who's joining us virtually on DCS Connect. It's going to be a great show today. I'm here with our First Sergeant David Velazquez.
Your TRANSCOM First Sergeant.
And for he and I, that's right. For he and I, this is our first TRANSCOM show together, and so what we thought we would do is interview each other and ask a couple of questions to allow you all the opportunity to get to know us a little bit better, okay? And then when we're done, we just have a couple of questions. We'll open it up to the floor, and you guys can ask whatever you want, and then we'll close up with some announcements, okay? So without further ado, First Sergeant Velazquez, tell us a little bit about yourself and your career with the Air Force.
Thanks for that question, ma'am. So originally from Chicago, Illinois. Grew up in I would say a small town, but it's really not small. Just on the southwest side of Chicago. It's called Cicero. I lived there till I was around 12 years old. When I was around 12, we moved to Colorado, Pueblo, Colorado, and that's where I went to middle school and high school. So in January 2000, that's when I joined the Air Force. I spent my first 16 and a half years as a port dog. Yes. And for those of you that aren't familiar with what a port dog is, it is a air transportation career field. So primarily at the tactical level, you know, moving cargo and passengers on aircraft. So Scott, here, this is my sixth assignment. I've had 4 assignments overseas, I'm sorry, 4 assignments stateside and 2 assignments overseas. In 2016, that's when I got vectored to become a first sergeant. So prior to TRANSCOM, I had 5 units as a first sergeant and 7 different commanders. So the first unit I was in was aerial port. There was a small gap between having our first sergeant was deployed, and they needed a first sergeant, so I had already been vectored. So they let me be a first sergeant there in the aerial port for about 3 or 4 months. Then I moved over to, had a maintenance group. After maintenance, I had 2 medical squadrons that I was the first sergeant for. And then recently, just before coming here, for about a year, I was a first sergeant for a security forces squadron. So that's kind of the professional side. The personal side of it is so I'm married, been married for 4 years to my wonderful, loving wife, Jenny. We have a 11-month-old daughter, Vivian. She's almost 11 months. In about 10 days, she'll be 11 months. Then I have 4 older kids that don't live with me. My son, Michael, he's 17. My daughter, Jackie, she's 16. And then my son, AJ, is 13. And my daughter, Allie, is 12.
Wow, that's a full house.
It is a full basketball team.
Yeah, all right. Well, great. So how about upon your arrival, what guidance or input did Chief France give you in preparation for this position, which it sounds like you're very well versed for?
So shortly after arriving, he gave me some great advice. So we sat down, we had an office call. We sat down and talked about some things, and it was a little bit after I got here because he was TDY and leave, and just me getting settled and things. But once we finally met, I had a chance to kind of see the unit a little bit, get kind of a feel for that. And he gave me a lot of great sound advice. But I would say the one thing that was probably the most simple advice that he gave me, but was the most impactful for me anyway, was he told me to be yourself. He said, be yourself, keep doing what you're doing, keep doing what got you here to TRANSCOM. And that was important for me to hear. TRANSCOM is a very large, complex organization. And me, I'm a very hands-on first sergeant. I like to be involved. When there's things going on with folks that are in my unit, I want to be in there and know what's going on and help out where I can. And one thing that as a first sergeant in the Air Force, we have a first sergeant's creed. And I think one thing that kind of defines that a little bit for us, the last 2 lines of that Air Force creed say, my job is people and everyone is my business. And that's kind of where that hands-on comes from. But at the same time, for this organization, I'm very cognizant that we have a lot of different directorates. We have all of our different service elements. And I think the one key thing with that is that there's very competent senior officers and enlisted members that are in charge of and running those different sub-organizations, I would say. And I'm very cognizant of that. They're very capable of taking care of the people that are within their directorates and within their service elements. So for me, it's kind of a balance. It's a balance of being involved, but also knowing that they're capable of handling things, but then being there to support when and if need be. And so I think that that little tidbit of advice to be hands-on, be who you are as a first sergeant, who you've been, was really impactful for me.
Yeah, that's some great advice. That's some great advice.
So Joan Kotulich, my turn. So why don't you go ahead and tell everyone a little bit about yourself and what you were doing before you arrived here to TRANSCOM.
All right. So I was born and raised in New Jersey and proud of that. I've got 29 years in the United States Army. I am a reserve, a member of America's Army Reserve for the last 21 or so of those years. And my civilian career is with IBM, where I'm a partner with IBM Global Business Services, and last served for those folks as an account executive. My home is in Arlington, Virginia, so I'm out here on the GeoBatch model, and I've got my better half back there working for Department of Homeland Security, and 2 grown daughters, as I like to say, who are off the payroll. One of them's going to turn 30 next month, and the other one just turned 24. So throughout my career, I've had just a number of great opportunities to deploy. Back in 2007, as a matter of fact, when I was with DLA, I was able to deploy into the CD dock at Camp Arifjan. And if you've been here for a long time, that was when Admiral Harnachek was at the D dock back then. When I came back, I was able to command an Army watercraft battalion out of Fort Eustis, Virginia. And then at brigade level, I commanded the 655th Regional Support Group, which is headquartered up in New England. And I had all the sustainment, reserve sustainment, Compo 3 soldiers in New England. And then I ended up with one more brigade command with the 77th Sustainment Brigade they're out of Fort Dix, New Jersey, Joint Base McGuire-Dix Lakehurst. And in fact, that unit is deployed today over to Camp Arifjan doing the sustainment mission. And so when I left there, that's when I was promoted to General Officer and took command of the 143rd Expeditionary Sustainment Command, an ESC, which is headquartered in Orlando, Florida. And I like to call us the SEC ESC because all of those soldiers, about 99 units and just over 9,600, were located throughout the southeastern United States, the Carolinas, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. So that was a good time. And the last thing I did with those folks before coming to TRANSCOM is deployed last year in 2018 with my headquarters. So we were at Camp Arifjan. We fell under the 1st Theater Sustainment Command and were responsible for the sustainment mission throughout the CENTCOM AOR. And during that tour, obviously the CD dock was integrated fully into our operations, and we had shared great successes with those folks. So I'm actually feeling pretty good that what I just finished doing has prepared me pretty well for this organization.
I'd say it definitely has. So, ma'am, what guidance did General Lyons provide to you upon arrival here to TRANSCOM?
Yeah, so I'll tell you, even before I got to TRANSCOM, when I was going through the interview process and then subsequently he offered me the position, he made it very clear from the beginning about the criticality of the mission of U.S. Transportation Command, to lead the greater joint deployment distribution environment and to be able to project and sustain the joint force anywhere in the globe to meet our national objectives. And what he was very, very clear to say in the Chief of Staff role is that what he wanted me to be able to do is integrate and synchronize across the staff. And all of that is obviously consistent with his vision and his priorities of warfighter readiness. So, needless to say, I was pretty pumped, and I had a couple of months there between being offered the position until I showed up in June. And so I took the opportunity to study up on the command. I went, being in D.C., I was able to go meet with the TRANSCOM L&O and Leg Affairs folks that are in D.C., get spun up a little bit on some of his high priorities like sea lift recapitalization and air refueling. And then I also got spun up on what it means to be a chief of staff. And so when I showed up in June, he said the exact same things to me. He said, you know, this is TRANSCOM, this is what we do. We're on the road to greatness, focusing on warfighter readiness, and I expect you to integrate and synchronize the staff. And so with that, it was game on. And you know, my expectation was to come here and be a member of a world-class organization and a high-performing team. And I will tell you, TRANSCOM, you did not disappoint.
Awesome.
Yeah. Okay, so first Art,
Yes,
my
ma'am.
turn.
All right.
So you've been on board now for a little over a month, 2 months. And so the question is, what have you been working on, and what have you noticed about the command?
So for me, it's been learning, a lot of learning. You know, this is, like I said earlier, it's a very complex organization. So for me, so two aspects of learning I think that are important for me to point out. The first is the base. So, you know, for a first sergeant, it's one thing to move from one unit to another. It's a whole other thing to PCS to a new base and also having a new unit. And I say that because you know, part of being a first sergeant is having a network, right, of the base support agencies and whatnot that you can tap into when you need to for your folks. So it's not just learning the organization and where those base agencies are at. That's kind of the easy part because I've been doing that for a number of years. But it's really knowing who's on the other end of the line when I make a phone call and having those connections and having already built those relationships with those helping agencies. It just makes it a lot easier and a lot smoother when you're working on an issue for someone. The other thing is the unit. So, you know, I've been working on touring all the different directorates. So I've hit 4 so far that I've been able to tour. I've been working with the senior enlisted in each of those directorates to get tours to kind of see people in the spaces and the faces that are moving the mission. I have the rest of them working with the rest of the senior enlisted to get the rest of those tours down, so I can kind of better understand what folks are doing. So the other part you asked is, you know, what I noticed about the command. So there's 2 things that I noticed about the command that really jumped out at me. The first is the mission. You know, it's a very impressive mission. It's a huge mission, and the part about the mission that really kind of impressed me, especially as I'm going around the directorates, is that the directorates, you know, they each individually kind of have their own focus, their own programs and whatnot that they're working on. But there's a lot of overlap between the directorates, and to see the folks, you know, some folks sitting in, you know, they're part of one directorate but sitting in another, and just kind of working together to get the overall mission of TRANSCOM done is absolutely, to me, it's amazing. It's impressive. You know, and then the other piece of that I noticed is the people. And, you know, I got asked this a lot, especially within the first couple, you know, weeks or even month of being here is, you know, how are you settling in? How are things going? And I think my response majority of the time, the first thing is, you know, the people are great. Like the people of TRANSCOM are just, you know, there's just good people here.
I second.
Yeah, and you know, it's one thing when you're, you know, sometimes and I haven't had this here, but you know, you get that cliche, you know, hey, how you doing? How's it going? How was your weekend? That kind of thing. Well, it seems like the people here actually want to know how your weekend was, how your day's going, you know, and they're interested to hear, you know, what you did over the weekend and, you know, how your family's settling in and those things. And to me, those things are very important. They speak a lot to the organizational climate, you know, so for me, those are the 2 probably main things that stuck out, is the impressive mission and definitely the people.
Awesome, thank you. So the next question is, you have had a very well-rounded career, and I think you've touched on this a little bit, but can you kind of pull the thread a little bit more on what experiences you're bringing with you that you believe are going to assist you here in this important role as the first sergeant?
Okay, so this is a loaded question in a good way. So I would say if I had to break down my experiences into categories, I would say there's probably 3 categories of experiences that I think greatly contribute to, you know, being a well-rounded first sergeant. Those 3 categories are my first sergeant experiences, my logistic experiences and my personal experiences. So, as I said earlier, as a first sergeant, I've had 5 units, 7 different commanders. So each of those units has that I had prior to here. They each have a different climate. So all Air Force, but all had a different climate. When you go into a maintenance group, very different climate and a very different culture, really, than the medical group, than medical squadrons. And the same thing, with security forces, very different cultures in security forces as well. So kind of getting in there, understanding the mission, the individual missions, and the different cultures that go along with those missions and those people, you inevitably grow from those experiences. The other piece to that is the commanders, 7 different commanders. So they ranged from brand new commanders, never had been in command before, to one of the maintenance colonels I had. He had over 12 years experience in command. Mm-hmm. And I'd get 10 feet from the door, and he already knew exactly the direction and the way he was going to go before I even brought the issue up. And very different perspectives from that seasoned commander versus a new commander, and which can be a very good thing at times. And then along with those commanders, a lot of chiefs too as well, and superintendents of those organizations too that also had a lot of experiences. And you learn a lot and you grow a lot from conversations when you get behind closed doors and you're addressing issues within a command structure. So, even though some of those times in those units were shorter than others, it doesn't negate the fact that of being in that environment and having those conversations with those individuals and really just absorbing and learning from the different perspectives that everyone had. So that moves me on to logistics. So I grew up in logistics. I grew up in kind of, as I said, at the tactical level, working in the aerial port. And really that's where the rubber meets the road in terms of, aircraft. I always like to say, I grew up in Air Mobility Command. From a young port dog as an airman basic, up through a master sergeant. I grew up on the flight line, slinging chains, pushing cargo, moving passengers. That's what I grew up doing. So lots of deployments, lots of extended TDYs. And I want to put this story in there because I think it's very relevant to here at TRANSCOM. So in 2009, I was stationed in Osan Air Base in Korea. And we went on they called it a deployment, but it wasn't really, we were on CED orders. But they took 2 or 3 people from each of the en route stations throughout the Pacific and sent us to Diego Garcia. And we were part of the name of it was the Joint Task Force Island Striker. And the basics of what that was is U.S. TRANSCOM had come down and said, hey, the AOR commander needs this striker brigade in Afghanistan to help fortify some of the different voting booths and whatnot, the voting areas for the very first Afghan election. So what they were doing is we moved, the Army moved a brigade of strikers and support equipment from Tacoma, Washington to the seaport. They loaded on boats. They moved across the ocean to Diego Garcia, which is where we were there with the Army and the Navy, offloaded all that stuff, all that equipment. Some of it had to get modified before actually going downrange. They did it right there. And then we loaded it on C-17s and AN-124s to go directly from Diego Garcia into Afghanistan. So, at a very young age, I would say in the military at that point, only 9 years in and a young staff sergeant, it was very, very cool to see that, right? And who would think, 10 years later, I had to do some quick math, 10 years later, here I sit at TRANSCOM, right? And I'm walking down I'm coming in one day from the SDDC side, and I'm walking down the AQ hallway, and the third picture on the left-hand side as you're walking in the building is a picture of that staging area where we were staging the cargo, the strikers and everything else. And I specifically saw that picture, and it rang a bell, and I'm like, that looks awfully familiar. And sure enough, I remember taking that picture. Not me personally, I don't think. I have a similar photo, but the public affairs folks, they wanted to take that picture so they could capture what we were doing. And so we took a K-loader, and hopefully there's no safety folks in here, but we took the K-loader and we raised it up to its highest level that it goes, right? And we got that kind of overshot of the staging area to capture that picture. So to walk through the halls here and kind of see that photo was like, for me it's kind of full circle, right? With my logistics background and whatnot, and then coming into TRANSCOM as the first sergeant and seeing that picture there, it was kind of that aha moment for me. But anyway, yeah, 500 pallets, 300 strikers, and over 600 support vehicles that we moved in a matter of months. And we only had about 20 port dogs out there moving all that cargo. But we did have a lot of help. The Army came out, and I think the Navy too as well, if I remember right, to help load some of that stuff. So it was definitely a full-on, all-hands effort to make that happen. So the last piece, as far as experiences, I would say are the personal experiences. And I'll tell you, I think one thing that really contributes to being a first sergeant is your personal experiences. I think it's important, how we grew up and the things that we faced, whether adversity or what have you, the good times and the bads, the ups and downs, they all contribute to making up a first sergeant. So I had a lot of life lessons, we'll just say that. And there's some things that I had to learn the hard way. And one of the things we do as first sergeants is we advise on discipline to the commander. And I have some experience with that, not just as a first sergeant, but some very personal experience. I've at about 4 years in the military, I had to stand tall in front of the commander, on that side of the desk at the position of attention, to get some not so good news. But you know what? At the end of the day, I put myself in that position, right? And I think that, well, I'll get to that in a minute. But that's something that as I talk with folks and address when people are going through those kind of things, I can relate. I know what it means to kind of unintentionally not exactly hear what the commander's saying because you're so your blood's going, your adrenaline's going, and you're concerned, right? So I always make it a point to reiterate everything that was said afterwards in my office because I know how that is. So the other piece is relationships. So as I said earlier, I have 4 kids that don't live with me, and it's not always easy. It's not always an easy thing, especially when it comes to PCSs, TDYs, deployments, all that stuff. So I've been divorced. I know how that feels. And so, being able to, kind of understand that when folks are going through those things is important as a first sergeant. I can honestly say, I've been there and I can understand. So, with those experiences, and there's lots of others, but we probably don't have time for all that. One thing that I've learned as a first sergeant, and really in life in general, is that we all go through ups and downs. We all have things that happen. We make choices. Sometimes we make mistakes. But the key is learning from those things. And in those moments when you have those low moments, when I was standing tall in front of the commander, in the things that got me to that point, I think the biggest thing is not letting those moments define us, right? It's how we recover from them, where that turning point is. And I could tell you, and this goes into kind of a little bit of leadership perspective for me too as well. I wouldn't be sitting here as a number one in uniform period, but as a first sergeant, as a TRANSCOM first sergeant, had it not been for the chain of command that I had at that time, that took care of me, looked out for me and said, hey, maybe there's a little bit more to this person than the mistakes and the bad decisions that they made at this one point, right? I paid my dues and I got through it, but again, what defines us is what we allow to define us. And for me, it's been proving, at the time to those leaders, but really at the end of the day to myself that, hey, this doesn't define me. These things, these mistakes I made don't define me. But what does is how I recover from those things. And I think that that as a first sergeant is definitely those 3 different experiences. The first sergeant experiences, logistics, and my personal experiences are kind of kind of what I believe has prepped me to take this position.
That's some great insight. Thanks for sharing, because that's a lot of personal information. But you're absolutely right. You know, we all make mistakes. The key is to not make them again.
Yes, ma'am.
And it's all about choices and making good choices. So that's awesome. So is this your first joint assignment then?
So first joint assignment, not assigned as, so as I said, different TDYs. I mean, every one of the deployments that I was on, I did 5 different deployments. Those were all integrated with the, with either the Army or the Navy, working. Most of my deployments, the MCT, was with the Army, was right next door, literally, and our ATOC office was right there. So working in conjunction to get the stuff to the folks at the front lines.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
But first assigned joint position, yes.
Cool. Good.
Yes, ma'am. So General Kotulich, my turn. So what areas do you think you'll focus on based on your assessment of the command so far?
So knowing that I've got about 2 years to really, make an impact and continue to build on the hard work of my predecessor, General Flournoy, I do think there's a couple of areas that I can sort of sink my teeth into and try to drive some value-added improvement that would be consistent with, the direction that General Lyons has established for the command. And so the first one is COOP, continuity of operations. I have experience in my civilian career where we call it business continuity and disaster recovery. And so what I gave some direction to our mission assurance team to do was go out and come back with a handful of scenarios sort of on a continuum of disaster, right? So everything from a power outage in the building for more than 24 hours to something super bad when we're having the worst day in America. And so what the directors should expect to see in the next couple of weeks is I'd like to hand those scenarios out and then ask those directors to take some time. It's not going to be, give it back to me in a week kind of thing, but take a couple of months to sort of visualize what mission essential tasks each of their divisions need to be able to do in the first, 30 minutes, in the first hour, in the first 4 to 6 hours, in the first 24 hours, or in the first 48 hours, again, relative to one of those scenarios. I think that's something that will help us drive some capability requirements and continue to posture us as a resilient, organization that would be ready to fight a high-end fight. And then the second area really is around manpower planning and facilities. So, what I'd like to be able to do in lockstep with the J1 and all the directorates is really take a look at the hard work that's gone on to understand how to transform the way that they're doing business, again, consistent with the direction that General Lyons gave to the command, right? Looking at becoming being able to fight the high-end fight, focusing on warfighter readiness, all of his priorities about a data culture, enterprise data environment, race to the cloud, and all those things. It sort of strikes me that as the directorates identify capabilities that they need, the translation there is to manpower and facilities. And so one of the things that I've observed in a little over 2 months here is it sort of seems like we're kind of busting at the seams in a number of areas with respect to SCIF space, open storage, and even in some cases just workspace. So what I want to be able to do, again, is synchronize and integrate across the staff and take a look at what a TRANSCOM of perhaps 2025 and beyond is going to look like. And I think that could be an enduring, something that it wouldn't finish on my watch, but something that I'd be able to initiate and start and sort of shepherd and then hand off to the next person to finish up.
Absolutely. So, ma'am, I understand you were in command almost continuously for the last 9 years, from battalion to 2 different brigades to the 143rd. How is that shaping your perspective as Chief of Staff here at TRANSCOM?
Yeah, so, when you are a commander, you're responsible for a lot of things. And having commanded at all those different echelons, and finishing up in a very, very large organization like the 143rd, I'm pretty galvanized around our our military doctrine of, assigning responsibilities and authorities to commanders for training and readiness of their service members and units to be able to perform a wartime mission. And it has to be that once that commander puts out the intent and gives the vision, that everyone underneath understand it and see their role in it, and then everybody's marching in the same direction. So I think that's really important. And again, in some cases, not completely different than the business world, but definitely something that is very specific to us in the military. And so, what I feel like my role as the chief, because I'm not the commander anymore, is to make sure that General Lyon's priorities, his vision, and his intent are clearly communicated down to the lowest levels of the headquarters staff, right? And to work towards gaining that shared awareness and that shared understanding, and then leverage that, again, synchronizing and integrating across the staff to be able to really deliver the results that TRANSCOM needs to be able to deliver to, our subordinate component commands, to the ultimately to the greater JDDE, and then at the end of the day to those global combatant commanders that are prosecuting the warfight. Okay, so First Sergeant Velazquez, for my last question, tell everyone something about yourself that they might not ever guess or ever know.
Okay. All right. So I have two things. So first, does anybody know what a PK is?
Uh-oh.
Okay.
We got one head nod from the chaplain.
Oh, the chaplain, of course. So PK, it means preacher's kid. So my dad is he was a Baptist preacher. So he retired last year in 2018, February 2018, after 46 years of being a preacher. So for some reason, a lot of people wouldn't guess that. I don't know why, but that is something that is unique to me, and a lot of people don't know. Another thing is I dropped out of high school. So I got my GED. I dropped out in 1999. So I'll say this about being a dropout. So for the longest time, so as I talked a little bit about experiences and whatnot and letting things define you, for a long time I let that define myself, right? I dropped out of high school. I was fortunate enough to even get in the Air Force. At the time, we were only letting in, I think it was like less than 2% of recruits could have a GED. And I was one of 6 in the state of Colorado to get in the military, or to get in the Air Force at that time. But anyway, I got tired of, you'd be surprised when it comes to applications, whether you're at the medical clinic or you're registering to vote or, whatever. Look at the forms and pay attention to what they ask. They ask you what's your highest level of education. And I got really sick and tired of putting GED. So I stopped eventually. I stopped letting that define myself, and I took advantage of some of the Air Force programs that are out there for schooling. In around 2009 is when I kind of started that adventure. But since then, I've gotten 2 associate's degrees through the Air Force, and then this last year in March, I finished my last course for my bachelor's degree.
Oh.
So I graduated in May. I got to walk in May.
Yeah, thank you.
So for me, that was huge, right? And so that's kind of that little carrot that for me, personally, in terms of goals. And my goal, and I'll tell everybody this so you can kind of help hold me accountable, my goal is to, at least start, and if not, try and finish my master's degree in this assignment here at TRANSCOM.
Yeah, good. Those are great goals.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
All right, ma'am. So for your last question, please share something about yourself that our teammates wouldn't know.
Okay. So, everybody's got to have a hobby, right? And I fancy myself to be something of a wine aficionado, and yeah, that's right. And the genesis of that is actually going back to 2004 when I was a young major, and my first deployment into Iraq. It was Operation Iraqi Freedom 2, and I don't know how many of you were around back then, but that was not the most fun I'd ever had, right? I mean, that was war. That was a pretty bloody, nasty, dangerous battlefield. And when I came back, you know, a friend of mine had taken this wine class, and he knew I enjoyed wine, and so he says, hey, Deb, you know, there's this wine class you might want to take. And, you know, I thought about it for a minute and decided to do it. It was about 12 weeks, and it was in the evenings at this art institute in D.C. in Arlington. And so it was at the end of my, you know, I had to leave work early to go to this class that lasted until like 11 or 12 o'clock at night.
Wow.
But it was something completely different than the Army, certainly completely different from that tour in Iraq, and, you know, even very disassociated from what I was doing as a businesswoman with IBM. And, you know, I just really became enamored with the viticulture, the history of wine, growing the grapes, all the different varietals and the countries and the character. And so at any rate, the you know, that sort of became my hobby, in addition to working out, in addition to the Army, you know. And so the end state for me on that is when I finally retire from the Army and I finally retire from IBM, I could see a third career. You know, I'd be perfectly happy to go out to somewhere in California or Oregon or even Washington State, you know, working in a pouring room at some vineyard somewhere, you know, just people walking in the door and, you know, asking them what kind of, do they like white, do they like reds, and, you know, just pouring wine for them, letting them try different things, and just sipping all day long. And, you know, you walk out and, you know, you're looking at acres and acres of vineyards and the sun coming up and the sun going down. And anyway, that's my thing is wine, and that's my goal and objective. So.
Sounds like a great retirement plan.
Yeah, yeah. All right, so that was fun, First Sergeant.
Yes, definitely was.
All right, so now you guys know a little bit more about First Sergeant Velazquez and I, and we've got a little time left, so I want to go ahead and, you know, open it up to any kind of questions that anybody in the audience might have. I don't think we can field questions from the DCS crowd, but anything at all.
Peg Niagara from the History. Sergeant, what is your way ahead? You say you work with the senior enlisted leader. We have a very senior, talented senior enlisted group. Each of the services have, I believe, a senior enlisted leader there. What's your way ahead? How do you plan to make your mark here?
There's been a couple things that, you know, have kind of come up just in general as far as, you know, just the nature of the command and where we're located. I know there's, you know, the medical working group. You know, they came and did the town hall. I would say that's probably one of the biggest things that's on my radar right now is, you know, how can I work with the base and kind of make that bridge to make sure that our folks are being, you know, they're getting what they need and what they require. And sometimes, I think a lot of times that's just communication. And so at any rate, so for that, we're actually sitting down later today with the 375th to kind of start some of those talks and reignite that working group to work towards that. With that being said, you know, I think too there's a lot of different professional organizations on the base, and you know, me being a part of some of those, the top 3 is one of them. You know, I've spoken with that executive council for that organization, and you know, one of the first things that they said, and it was kind of in my mind already from talking with Senior Master Sergeant May, my predecessor, was one of the things that they wanted to do was, hey, can we work towards getting more folks from TRANSCOM, you know, all the services, to start trying to be more involved in those organizations. And again, I think it goes back to communication, you know, just having some of the communications that I've had with some of the specifically senior enlisted folks and whatnot. You know, the thought was that those were Air Force organizations. So, you know, I'm working towards that. I'm happy to say that we had a top 3 meeting last week, and the Marine and Army senior enlisted were both attended with me at that meeting. You know, and they're kind of welcomed with open arms. I'm sure the Navy would have too as well, but they had prior engagements. They couldn't make that meeting. But I'm also working with the 5-6, who's kind of that middle tier NCO folks, to kind of do the same thing. And you know, one thing I've learned, especially being a first sergeant, as I kind of mentioned earlier, you know, networking is key. And you know, when you build those relationships, regardless of position that we're in, and then you need something, and especially if you're in a leadership position and you have folks that you're in charge and you're charged with taking care of, it's a lot easier to get things done when you've already kind of met those people, at these professional organizations, right, at these meetings, to have those crosstalks and to say, hey, I remember Master Sergeant so-and-so, oh yeah, and he works over here in the med group. Maybe I can just give him a ring. I know his phone number, and get something done, right, for either myself or for some folks that I'm in charge of. And so I think that's critical. I really think it's critical, and I can tell you that's probably one of the bigger nuggets that's on my radar.
Yeah, good.
I am Desiree Strong. I started TRANSCOM last Monday, so I'm brand new. I'm a retired Chief Master Sergeant. And when I looked at you when you walked through the door, I just get giddy when I see women at higher levels. So do you feel inclusive at that level? And do you realize the impact that you have on females in the military right now?
So thanks for the question. And so I think there was two questions there. I do feel completely included. I feel I've had this conversation very, very recently. I was actually had the good fortune to be a chapter in a book that was written by a woman who's a teacher, and the book is for adolescent young ladies, right, teenagers, and it's called Women Heroes in the U.S. Army, and that's not a plug for the book, but through the course of that, we had a book signing at the Women's Memorial in D.C. For the launch, and so I was asked a question somewhat similar to that, and the time that I came in when I graduated from West Point in 1990, there was a great time of opportunity for women, and again, in the Army, which was my perspective and my upbringing, for command and for, all sorts of opportunities to lead and to learn. And something like Ranger School, which is something that I candidly, if I had the opportunity to do when I was coming out of West Point, I would have hopped on it in a minute. But for some reason, at that time, to me, it didn't seem like exclusion or discrimination. It just sort of seemed the way that it was, which is why it's fantastic, when I look today at the opportunities that all the women in all the branches of the services have to do, things like Ranger School or be in infantry units or fly F-35s. We have the first female Marine lieutenant who's going to be flying F-35 jets for the Marines, and it's an evolution of things. But the point that I want to make is, I actually didn't have the opportunity to work for women while I was on active duty or even in the reserves. My leaders were men, and so those gentlemen that I had the great good fortune to work for, and I realized that not everyone has had that opportunity. What they were driving towards was the best team, right? To get the best results, and it didn't matter, your gender or your race. They were really looking for the people who was going to make them successful, candidly, right? And so, I feel very fortunate with some of the leaders who actually later became general officers, guys like retired Major General Jim Chambers and Lieutenant General Bill Mortensen and Major General Bob Radden. I mean, those folks weren't general officers when I worked for them, but it sort of describes the quality of folks that I had the opportunity to work for, and they're the ones who gave me the opportunity, put me in the positions of responsibility, and allowed me to either deliver results or not, right? And so, I'm thrilled and completely humbled to be a Major General in the Army Reserves. There's no question about it. It's not anything that I thought was going to happen. But what strikes me is the environment today is very inclusive, and General Lyons, Admiral Mewborn, I don't think anybody looks at me as anything other than the Chief of Staff, and it's kind of going to be the same thing. I'm either going to deliver the goods, right, or I'm not. And so then the second part of your question is, do I realize the impact? And that's a funny question, because if there's other female senior leaders, enlisted officers, I haven't typically gone out of my way necessarily, to talk to or to address other women in the military service, in probably the first 3/4 of my career, because it didn't exactly occur to me to do that, right? But in this, last quarter of my career, and again, I've got 29 years now, I have taken the opportunity to try to get out more, and to, whether it's speaking at, different women's events, when I've been asked to do those things, I make it a point to support, because I do think it's important to get out. That's why I was thrilled to have the opportunity to, when I asked to be a chapter in this book. And again, that's directed at young ladies, right, who are, just starting out. I think that is important. But I would tell you, I was asked the question very recently when I was interviewed for something, what advice I would give to young girls today. And my initial instinct was really, the same advice that I give the young boys, right? It is, go out there and challenge yourself. Don't hold yourself back. I am an ardent believer in, going into the military, where you get afforded opportunities at a very young age to do things that, my friends that I grew up with can't even imagine doing, right? And take advantage of education opportunities to command, and go for it, right? That is the advice that I would give to a young lady or a young boy, a young man. And candidly, now the opportunities are, I do believe, unlimited in many ways for women today. So thanks for asking the question. It doesn't escape me where I am, but what I see coming behind me, I will tell you that the women that went before me, I will always give them great gratitude and thanks, right? I feel that I have stood on the shoulders of giants, right? When you take a look at a retired Brigadier General Wilma Vaught, if you're in the Air Force and General Vaught, when she retired, she had a vision and a passion, and drove the build and operation of the Women's Memorial today, which is in D.C. Just some giants. But when I take a look at what's behind me that's coming, man, get out of the way. I mean, these ladies are, they're on American Ninja Warrior, they are flying F-35s. I mean, they are getting after it. It's exciting to see. Thanks for asking that question.
Ma'am, Scott Ross from Public Affairs. Good to talk with you again. In addition to being an accomplished woman, I think you're unique in the sense that because you're a partner at IBM, you've seen the C-suite in corporate America, and now you're sitting in the C-suite in one of the highest levels in the Department of Defense. I'm wondering the skill sets and the expertise that you have from corporate America, from your position in IBM, how that is helping you in your mission here as the Chief of Staff in integrating and synchronizing the staff.
So that's a great question. Thanks for that one. And I've spent a lot of time, looking at that and thinking about that too. And one of the things, just to add a little perspective, when you go and get nominated to be a partner in global business services, it's not a given. It is a panel process. It's an interview process, and you really have to sell your value proposition to IBM. And that's different than the military, right? The military, you are really resting pretty heavily on your accomplishments. You put a packet together. You don't get a say. No one interviews you. And so it's very different. And so, one of the things that I learned a long time ago is that being an Army officer makes me a better IBMer, and being an IBMer makes me a better Army officer. And, I believe that because, in the Army, and I mentioned this when I answered the question about command and commanders, and then becoming a Chief of Staff to support the commander's vision and intent. We have a structure and a framework, and we have Uniform Code of Military Justice, and we have a way of operating that is absolutely necessary when you are going to put men and women very potentially in harm's way, right, for the greater good of national objectives. Not always a great position to be in as a commander, but something that is absolutely comes with the job, right? When you work in the corporate world, you don't have those same sorts of sort of built-in tools, right? Regulations, structure, right? Orders, lawful order. I give you a lawful order. It's not immoral. It's not illegal. It's not unethical, and you are obliged, whether you agree or not, to execute the order, right? And you don't have that in the civilian world. So, what I found is that, and again, working with very, very talented people as well in the civilian world, very talented, but they have a lot more mobility, right? A lot more lateral ability to, if they want to leave, your company, or if they want to go work for another company, or if they want to leave my division and go work for, that is tremendous flexibility in the civilian world. And again, you don't have that same amount of flexibility, right, in the military. We're very structured. You get PCS after such a period of time. You're going to PCS again. You might change jobs. So all that to say that what I've discovered in my civilian career to be successful is you have to figure out how to work with people and how to make many situations a win-win, right? It's not good enough to say my way or the highway. And there are certainly business leaders that do that. I'm not going to say that they're not, but for me, that's not the way that I feel like I was able to achieve the success that I was and work up a ladder in the corporate world. And I bring that in the military, to the military, right, in many cases. I try to be very fair when, I'm dealing with soldiers. You talked about, being a first sergeant. You try to look at things objectively. And, but at the end of the day, you do have this driving requirement of being able to perform the mission, right? And you do have, in the military, a difference of things like, physical readiness and medical readiness being a big point that First Sergeant touched on. And so one of the things I learned a long time ago, again, primarily being in command, is that, part of what I have to do in building the force and doing the training and the readiness is make determinations in some cases hard about whether or not a young lady or a young man has the ability to be a service member, right? It's not every young man or woman's God-given right to serve their country, no matter how much they want to, right? And at some point, it's a matter of just agreeing that this is not a good fit, and helping them find that next step, right? Because this military thing is just not working out for you, right? And we say now, we use words like treating everybody with dignity and respect, right? I grew up, again, 29 years, we talked to each other in a very different way when I was a young lieutenant in infantry divisions, right, than we do today. And so I think the point is, there's an element, that I bring to my military leadership style that is something that I had to work on when I left active duty and went over to the commercial space, because I had to change a little bit, right? But then there's also a way of looking at the mission in terms of, focusing on results. And in the civilian world, those results matter. They're measurable. And if you're not delivering, it's obvious, and it impacts the bottom line, and there are consequences, right? We don't really have that same measure of results in the military, but yet there are ways to measure, effectiveness. There are ways to measure readiness and results. And so I think the second answer to the question is not, the first answer being how you deal with people and how you lead and the development of your leadership style. I think the second answer is, really staying focused on, in the military, what it takes to move the ball down the field, to deliver, whether it's value-added improvement or incremental results, to ultimately, get across the finish line. And I think sometimes in the military, we see folks putting in a lot of effort, right? And in some cases getting caught in, what I like to call activity traps, right? But not necessarily moving the ball forward, right? And so that's the second piece. That's sort of a long long-winded answer, but, you know, two areas is leadership, and then the other one is an ability to focus on delivering measurable, tangible results. Okay. All right, well, listen, I think we're almost out of time here, so very quickly, I want to thank everybody again for joining First Sergeant Velazquez and myself. And before we let you go, I think First Sergeant Velazquez has a couple of announcements.
Yeah, so real quick, next week here on Scott, the Air Force Wounded Warrior Program will be here. They actually get here on Saturday. They'll be doing some things internally with the folks that are participating in that. But then next week, Monday through Friday, there's a lot of different sports events and competitions at the gym and other areas on the base. And they're going to have like daily briefings over at the Scott Event Center. So I'll send something out that'll kind of have that schedule. But I think the highlight for that for us here at TRANSCOM is on Wednesday the 21st at 1300. We will have one of those Wounded Warriors here to kind of give a little bit of a talk about their story and resiliency and whatnot. And I'll tell you from experience, I've been to one of those before, and they are outstanding, you know, to kind of hear those stories. It really puts into perspective sometimes some of the things that we deal with.
Are we going to bring them in here to the C?
Yes, ma'am. They'll be right here in
Excellent.
the C at 1300 on the 21st of August, next Wednesday.
Excellent, excellent.
Yes, ma'am.
Anything else?
That's all I had, ma'am.
All right. Well, listen, thank you all again for joining, and hopefully this was a little worthwhile for you, and I look forward to the next time, and then I'll put in a little plug. Friday I'm going to film my first COScast, and it will be about your participation in political activities. So stay tuned.
All right.
Thank you.